Earlier this month, 3 tons of space junk collided with the far side of the moon, hitting its rocky, cratered surface at about 5,000 miles per hour. This debris is thought to be a leftover rocket stage from a Chinese spacecraft that was launched back in 2014. While this crash is harmless to humans on Earth, it makes you wonder, what happens to all of the dead satellites, rockets, and other hardware that's been sent off into space and never decomposes? Where does it all go? Or not go? Dr. Jonathan McDowell is an astronomer and astrophysicist at the Center for Astrophysics at Harvard and the Smithsonian. He studies this field and says that the growing amount of space junk piling up just outside of Earth's atmosphere is a real problem.
There are several thousand satellites that are still orbiting the Earth that are dead. When a satellite dies, it doesn't just fall out of the sky, it's still got orbital velocity, just like the moon. It doesn't need an engine to stay up, right? And so there's plenty of dead satellites up there. And when you launch a satellite, the way you get it into orbit is with a rocket. And the upper stage of the rocket that pushes the satellite to orbital velocity has got orbital velocity too. And so it ends up in orbit. And so there's several thousand leftover rocket stages whizzing around the Earth. Then sometimes you have what we call adapters, that if you have 2 satellites on a single rocket, there's a widget that joins them together that gets thrown away, lens caps, all kinds of other stuff, general littering.
In addition to general debris, there are some rocket stages that have leftover fuel, and years later, they blow up, resulting in small bits of shrapnel forever floating in orbit. Satellites also accidentally or purposely collide into each other from time to time.
A number of military anti-satellite tests, as they're called, where the various militaries, Russia, America, China, India, have smashed missiles into a satellite and broken it up, which is really bad because it's sort of dangerous for all the other traffic.
McDowell says current radars show about 20,000 objects 10 centimeters or bigger closely orbiting the Earth.
We think there may be millions of smaller pieces that just are too small to show up on the radars. So, and they're dangerous as well. They may be small, but if they hit you at 17,000 miles an hour, that's going to hurt. And so there's a huge problem with satellites having to dodge this debris all the time and sometimes just getting hit by it.
There are currently around 5,000 working satellites orbiting the Earth, providing some kind of service. Billions of people rely on these machines every day for GPS, cellular coverage, internet, and weather forecasting.
10% are things that work and 90% are basically garbage. Rocket bodies, dead satellites, pieces of satellites, nuts, bolts, that sort of thing.
That's Dr. Moriba Jah, an associate professor of aerospace engineering and engineering mechanics at the University of Texas at Austin. He's also the co-founder and chief scientist of Privateer Space, a startup focused on mapping out all of the objects in orbit surrounding the Earth. The goal is to provide data that paints a clearer view of the landscape. This model could be particularly helpful for the growing number of companies aimed at solving the space junk issue. Jah says that there's a market for it because even the smallest piece of debris can damage a working satellite and knock out major services.
Just looking at current events happening around the globe with Ukraine and whatnot, so much information is uniquely provided by satellites. We couldn't get the data in other ways. Imagine if these satellites that are now monitoring and trying to see where people are trying to flee for their lives and help them out and these sorts of things. Imagine if a piece of debris just hit a couple of these. It's game over. There's just no way to support, learn, know any of these things. So I think these are very real consequences of losing satellites.
This floating trash also poses a danger to humans in space. In November of last year, 7 astronauts aboard the International Space Station took cover as they passed through an area littered with debris. A collision with one of these fast-traveling fragments could critically damage the space station. Thankfully, the ship made it through with no major incidents.
We've had some narrow shaves, and every time they go out, they see another little dent in the space station or a bullet hole where a piece has gone through the solar panel or something like that. And so as the amount of debris increases, the probability of a collision increases too. Every now and again, the astronauts have to fire the rocket engines on the International Space Station to dodge one of these pieces. And so it's really starting to be a very serious problem. It's not a problem for the tourists who fly on the suborbital missions like Blue Origin's New Shepard and Virgin Galactic Spaceship Two. They don't go high enough to be where most of the debris is. But it really is a problem if you're in orbit and either trying to operate an expensive satellite or you yourself are an astronaut on a mission in orbit around the Earth.
So, what needs to be done to reduce the amount of space junk circling our planet? McDowell says there are several different debris removal technologies being tested in space right now.
For example, a British satellite that captured another satellite with a net, and a Japanese satellite that's using a magnetic clamp to get onto its target satellite. And so those are kind of, those are being experimented with right now. And I think we're going to move from that phase into let's actually remove some debris and sort of make this operational in the next few years. One thing that did happen recently that's exciting is that China has gotten into the space junk game, or the space junk removal game, I should say, and had a garbage truck in space that went up to a dead navigation satellite that was contaminating a valuable orbit, the geostationary orbit. And they clamped onto this satellite and boosted it up another several hundred miles, and then let it go and came back down to the same geostationary orbit to look for a new target to tow. And so it's sort of like a tow truck in space. And so just clearing the junk out of the busiest lanes. So that's the first time that's actually been done, and that's encouraging.
Another key focus is pushing for better regulations on what goes into space in the first place. Removal means nothing if it's just replaced by another piece of hardware.
Aside from a couple of treaties that are broadly interpreted, there isn't much else. So pretty much any country can launch almost whatever they want. There are treaties talking about trying to not put weapons in space, nuclear weapons and just weapons in general, these sorts of things. But yes, there's broad interpretation to the treaties.
McDowell also adds that there are several financial and legal hurdles to consider as well when it comes to debris cleanup.
How are you going to fund this? It's not like the satellites you're removing have salvage value for the most part. And so you're going to have to fund this out of taxes somehow. What happens to the old Soviet rocket stages, particularly at the moment when we're not really in nice terms with the Russians. And so how do you navigate that? And so there's lots of tricky issues still to be worked out, but I think it's coming.
Between our reliance on satellites and our growing quest for space exploration and private space travel, it's important that Earth's orbit is cleaned up and maintained over time. If not, who knows what problems will arise as this situation gets worse. To find out more about this topic and our guests, Dr. Maura Bajaj and Dr. Jonathan McDowell, visit viewpointsradio.org. This segment was written and produced by Amira Zaveri. I'm Gary Price. Coming up on Viewpoints.
Under those circumstances, the situation became untenable, and the stresses that the requirements of caregiving required ultimately tore the family apart.
The mental and physical toll of caring for an elderly loved one. Then,
he made a pact with himself that he would do whatever it took, legally and educationally, not to die.
How one guilty man on death row duped the public into believing he was innocent. I'm Marty Peterson.
And I'm Gary Price. These stories in depth this week on your public affairs magazine, Viewpoints.
And that's Viewpoints for this week. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram to learn more about upcoming shows and find a library of past programs on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and Spotify. Plus, you'll always find previous segments and more information about our guests at viewpointsradio.org. Join us again next week for another edition of Viewpoints.